everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Very good. So my name is Volker Fröhlich. I'm very glad to be here for the third time as a speaker. And today I'm going to talk about how to debug the agent, which is not an exciting task, something everybody of you has done before, I suppose, but I'm trying to spice it up with some of my experience I have gathered in the 4 years of using Zabbix. I used to work for the Medical University of Vienna, but I'm now with Geizhals, a price comparison website serving the UK market, the Austrian market, the German market, and the Polish market. I'm a GNU Linux system administrator there, while I used to work in monitoring exclusively before my previous job. You may know me from my previous talks, previous works, maybe the most popular one being the action simulator, filling the gap of not knowing what is going to happen if a trigger strikes in terms of notifications and remote commands. Unfortunately, I didn't get to update that to the latest release. Let's see what the future brings. I've also been writing on various topics on the Zabbix blog and committed various front-end patches. In my spare time, I'm a Fedora packager. I'm the one responsible if something breaks with yum install on some packages. And I also started being active as an OpenStreetMap mapper last year. So the basic goal of this talk is to show how to debug the agent, what tools to use, what things to look at if you run into a situation where an item gets unsupported surprisingly, permanently, or just frequently, or the values are just not what you expect. And to be able to complete this task, you have to get some basic understanding of what is going on inside the agent. And the goal of this talk is to do the debugging somewhat efficient. We'll start out with some well-known facts, things you probably know about the agent, every one of you. And some of the very common gotchas we get a lot. I'm active on IRC, and there's lots of people coming in with all kinds of problems, and I try to pick some of the agent problems we see a lot. I'll point out some tools that I use in debugging and that basically solved all the issues I ever had. And then I'll go into the nitty-gritty details, the dark corners, things that are hidden in the GNU libc that affect the agent operation, and I'll finally give some brief examples of a way to go at a problem. So, we all know about the two modes of operation of the agent, the passive mode and the active mode. The passive mode being the server or proxy connecting via TCP connection to port 10,050 or reserved port. It's basically a wire protocol, and it's kind of inefficient because it creates one connection per item retrieval. It allows for something called remote commands to fire for some actions, and the active agent being sort of the opposite, the agent connecting to the server or proxy, asking for configuration and then submitting not just one but usually more values at a time to the server or the proxy. It has some nifty features that go with that. One is called auto-registration, where the host would register to the Zabbix server, so you don't have to configure it on your own manually. And it has the advantage that it can buffer data for a brief period of time in memory. And that's probably one of the first gotchas. Some items only work in active mode. Most prominently, probably the only one is log file monitoring. While this Zabbix sender or trapper protocol does not exactly belong to the agent, I'd like to talk about it briefly too, because there are some pitfalls as well. When When you're using this protocol, you're connecting to the server or the proxy and basically submitting a JSON object that contains data for various items and potentially various hosts, and it allows for timestamp data as well. Getting back to the agent has up to 3 or 4 different kinds of processes. There's the main process. It's not actually doing any work at all, but it's the parent process of the other processes. There is one process that is not particularly well known. It's the so-called collector process. This is something you unfortunately cannot expand with modules. Some people have voiced this request. The collector's task is to, for instance, read the disk stats and aggregate them for some time, and when you finally ask for the item, this is the one having the data for you. You can have a distinct number of passive workers. That's what the X is for. You can have 0 or I think 1,000 is the limit currently. And interesting to note, there is only one active worker if you're running the agent in active mode too, and this has some implications I will talk about in a few minutes. The main elements of the configuration file you would usually change are server and server active, server being the statement you use for passive items, and you can have a list or only a single entry of host names or IP addresses. Using host names there has some interesting implications we will talk about in a few minutes as well. I suggest to put more than one address there, and that's localhost I would like to add, because you can run Zabbix get locally, which is something I find very handy. Unfortunately, some distributions make it a bit difficult to install Zabbix get on any given host from packages. It's sometimes bundled in the proxy subpackage or the server subpackage. Stating more than one name for server active is usually not what you want to do. Then there is hostname. Hostname is a setting that is absolutely required for the active mode to operate. You can instead specify an item that is evaluated to get a hostname. User parameters is something you all know as well. Those are used to implement new item keys and the commands to retrieve the information necessary. We heard about modules yesterday as well. And there's the include instruction to include other configuration files, and you can also specify directories. This used to be a big pitfall before 2.2. When you specify the directory, it would include any given file inside the directory, and if you had your editor open and had a backup file in there, it would include this as well. If it had the same item keys, it would be duplicates, and the agent would revoke to start or backup files. That was unpleasant. You can now define a pattern there. Before we can actually blame the agent for anything going wrong with an agent item, we have to look at what's going on in the front-end configuration. A common gadget is configuration cache delay. You would usually have to wait for up to a minute plus item interval for an item to work. That's well known. Everybody knows that. The discovery rule interval is something not everybody is aware of, I guess. If you make changes to a prototype, don't expect to see those changes on the host before the discovery rule actually ran again. There's some mess going on with deactivating prototypes and activating and deactivating the actual items that came from prototypes on hosts. I think there's work in progress in this field. Also very common, people are confusing something. They thought they had assigned a specific template to some host, and it's actually a different host. And there's a bit of a problem with the audit log there, because the audit log is not covering everything that's going on in the front end. And what is maybe worse, it did not cover anything you did via the API, which is of course very powerful. So that's a big loss, and there's progress on this issue for version 3.0. Very common gotcha. somebody had a counter and decided he wanted to convert it to a rate item. The counter would be an integer, and he would just switch it to store as delta per second. And of course, the result would not be an integer anymore, and the item goes disabled, so he has to adjust the item type to float. Macros are something that are very, very easy to get wrong. How many of you know what happens if you define a macro on 2 templates and assign both to one host? Just raise your hands if you know. Yeah, that's not too many. So actually, the one with the lower template ID is the one to succeed. Might be a surprise for some. It's also easy to just mistype those macros or use a pound sign instead of a dollar sign mistakenly. Quoting in various places is a common gotcha with regular expressions, for instance. It's also difficult to get it right with user parameters where you pass on arguments. And now some gotchas that are closer to the agent. If you change the agent configuration, you have to restart the agent. That's second nature to you. Maybe it isn't for newcomers. There's common confusion still going on with agent.conf and agentd.conf. Something that happened with packages of mine was we left the symlink in etc Zabbix when we moved the file, and some people's configuration management would just overwrite the symlink, and the agent would still look in the new place and not find that file. That was very confusing to some. Firewalls are a common problem, be they on the system themselves, so anywhere in the network path. Permissions on anything, basically. Take a hierarchy of directories, for instance. You have to have executable permissions on any of these to finally get to the end of the directory. That hits many. And if you want to run a script, of course, it has to be executable, or you have to define a shell. Security frameworks are a common gotcha. RHEL and CentOS users just love Linux or not. We'll hear a talk about Linux afterwards. Sudo is a gotcha I run into from time to time for specifying everything correctly in the sudo configuration, but not adding sudo to the command. Also require no TTY is fooling some people. Switching to proxies can be very tricky because you have to update the agent configuration files, and trapper items have to go to the proxy as well. There's actually a trick where you can send trapping information to the server. If we have time left, I may talk about this as well, if you like. And timeouts. Timeouts sound very basic, but are very complex indeed. There are different timeout settings in different components of Zabbix, and the results can be surprising on which one is actually the one that is the important one. So these were the easy gotchas. What if it's something else? Restarting the agent? Not a very technical approach. Error messages, reading those is essential, of course, and they are scattered. There are error messages in the front end as a mouse over, and they are in the agent log, and they are in the proxy log, and they're in the server log, so you should have a good idea where to look at and what to expect. And you may want to introduce syslog to Zabbix, because it allows you to have timestamps in whatever format you like. Some people heavily dislike the timestamp format. And it allows you to separate messages upon severity, which is something you don't get in the flat file. You can't see the severity of a particular message. The default log level of any Zabbix component is free, and it actually has a lot of information in there already. It has problems in inter-process communication, problems with host names, not getting any active checks configuration from the data, problems with JSON structures, checks being not supported and all that. That's pretty much, so basically if you crank up the debug level to 4, the greatest benefits you get is you get to know which functions are run, which C code functions are run, and how long they took to execute. That gives you a good idea where something might go wrong. And maybe even more important, you get to see what is actually sent and what is actually received. This is very, very basic, very close to what you can get at all. Yeah, it might sound arrogant to some, but reading the source code is a good idea. Reading the Zabbix source code is not terribly difficult, particularly when it comes to how particular items are gathered. Most of the source code you will need is in the directory you can see over there, sorted by platform. And if all that is to no avail, you'll have to sniff the network traffic or trace the processes. And it's also beneficial to understand the protocols, because you can act as a client or server maybe and find out information that is otherwise difficult to obtain. Here's a brief list of tools I'm using. Networking tools on the right, other tools on the left. Zabbix Get, I mentioned it before. Some people use Zabbix agent dbinary to test items. Do you think that's a good idea? Or the opposite? We'll see. Everybody knows PS. Fewer people seem to know pgrep to get process information. This is something we will need later on to have the PID file. Sorry. The PIDs for the various processes we are going to trace. You can also find this information in the logs. They are logged on startup of the agent and the server. Yeah, strace is a piece of software to trace system calls. ltrace goes one step further and has the library function calls. ausearch is a utility that belongs to Linux. I'll leave that open to Patrick later on. I mentioned syslog. Syslog becomes particularly interesting when you've got a syslog server and collect all the data from all your systems to analyze that in a quantitative way and in a temporal way and in a visual way, and that is very valuable. Netstat gives you information about the connection states, socket connections on your host. The IP util is a very versatile tool that also allows you to configure routing on your host. tcpdump is essential for dumping network traffic. The name may be confusing. It's not for TCP only. It's everything that goes on the wire. Wireshark is a graphical application you can use to comfortably browse through what you recorded with tcpdump. Getaunt is a tool to query libraries. Basically the user library or the user group library on your system, but you can also use it to resolve host names and resolve it in the way an application does when it uses glibc. And this is exactly what we want to do if we are interested in name resolution problems. Netcat is a tool to to create a listener or to connect to a socket. Here's some strace and ltrace output. It really doesn't matter what it says there. It's just to give you an idea of what this looks like. And the main difference you can see there is the lines on the upper box. Those are system calls. Read is a system call, alarm is a system call. If you look to what ltrace does, you can see read and alarm as well. This is actually because glibc uses wrapper functions for abstraction between different operating systems. And those are usually called the same, but the lower box has additional information you cannot see with strace otherwise. You want to set up strace with the -f option to follow child processes, if any, and you can add a random number of bits of processes you want to monitor. Oftentimes those are the free listeners, for instance. Or not the free listeners, rather the free passive workers that are doing the work for querying passive items. Pretty much the same system as pretty much the same syntax with ltrace. It offers a lot of filtering, and you can write the output to files and analyze that later on. This is a shortened output of what tcpdump can do. This also allows for filtering, writing to files, and analyzing it later on with tcpdump in your comfort. If you're using tcpdump, it can be a good idea to run it simultaneously on both sides of the connection, because that's a good way to find hiccups in the network itself. And now we're going down to the details. I said before, you may use a host name, a DNS host name for server. And this involves a pointer lookup each and every time a server or proxy connects to an agent. And since you're doing that a lot with passive items, it's not exactly expensive, but you have to think about it. Foremost, you have to have a pointer record for that host. Otherwise, the agent will just refuse to let you connect. And an interesting detail is glibc's resinit function. Resinit is the initialization of name resolution in glibc. And this is run on startup. I said before, shall we restart the agent? If you are reconfiguring your resolve.conf file or your nsswitch.conf file, you definitely have to restart any Zabbix daemon to catch that. Get_info and get_name_info are the system calls Zabbix actually uses for resolving host names. Those are IPv6 aware. And if you want to know what a certain lookup would look like, I recommend you to do that with the gethunt utility using the ahosts option. If you have dual stack machines, also take a good look at guy.conf, which is responsible for like saying which result is the one that counts if there are multiple results, the IPv6 result or the IPv4 result. A funny case was some guy trying to run Zabbix get locally and it wouldn't work. He had an empty hosts file, he didn't define localhost there. DNS caching may also be something that is tempting to you. You may think that it could be a solution if DNS fails and still would keep on working. That usually doesn't work with any of these because they all respect the time to live entry of a record. And the only thing you can get out of caching is faster responses if you're on a flaky connection, if you have name servers that don't work properly. It's a good idea to have local caching, at least for the server. Routing is interesting on machines that have multiple interfaces, or at least multiple IP addresses. You may think you will connect using a certain source IP address, but you may not. And that's in the routing configuration you can do with IP, that command. IP root get and the target IP address is a very good way to figure out which source IP address is actually going to be used for a connection. A funny thing I found with Windows passive agents was that they would randomly stop working and then start working again, and that would happen like very often. And tracing that down with tcpdump and Wireshark revealed was that it was a ephemeral port reuse issue. In easy words, that's a safety measure of not getting old stuff in new connection. It's an unresolved mystery to me still, but I don't have access to Windows machines. But if you see Windows machines failing randomly, this is something you may want to investigate. And I said before, running tcpdump bilaterally is a good idea. We once had a firewall that was somehow faulty, and some TCP segments would just not arrive on the opposite side, and you would never know if you hadn't dumped at the same time on both sides. Timings and timeouts. Those are really tricky, and there's lots of them. There are various timeouts in the network stack. You don't necessarily know if you didn't invest time in learning about TCP/IP. actually it happens that the timer you specify in the agent configuration can be used multiple times. For instance, when an active agent asks for configuration, it has 7 seconds, for instance, if that is your setting, to do the actual connection. And once that's succeeded, he gets extra 7 seconds for the server to send his response. So you actually get more time than you had actually thought. I said before that the active agent only has one worker. This is a huge scalability issue for people relying on active only. If you have items running for like 20 seconds, you can give up on it. Escaping timeouts for long-running items is something that can be done. There's a trick involving the ads daemon. We would just schedule off the process to run and get the data back with Zabbix sender, basically. If you ever ran Zabbix get in a loop to get information from a number of hosts, and you run into one with a firewall that has a drop policy, you will hang in there for that host for 30 seconds. That is because Zabbix get has a timeout that is hard-coded to 30 seconds. It's actually a minute, sorry. The scheduling of active items is also an interesting thing. Normally, there's a deterministic scheduling for items, but with the active items, it is once the configuration is retrieved, basically that is when it starts. Unsupported items also have a behavior that is different with active other than passive, because they will be checked every time and not whatever your timeout setting is in the server. Another common gotchas. Who knows what is the shell you're executing when you use a user parameter? Hands up? One? There's very little. So it is hard-coded on Linux. To bin sh, what does that usually result in? Many systems that's bash. But if you invoke bash as sh, it's in a compatibility mode, and your bash-specific constructs just won't work anyway. Another interesting thing is the environment. The environment is basically dependent on what environment the agent has. You can check that in procfs easily, but you may find less than you expect. If you're testing items with Zabbix agent D instead of Zabbix get, you're working around some components. Of what is worse, you have no collector running, thus you cannot query disk I/O statistics, for instance. Debugging Zabbix sender is really hard. You can basically only do that on the proxy or on the server with a debug level, or with tracing or L-tracing the process, because it is not verbose at all when it comes to the response it gives to your request. Has anybody ever used web.page items, those HTTP checks items the agent offers? If you expect that that has a proper HTTP library in background, you are wrong. The only thing it ever expects is a 200 response. No forwarding, no TLS whatsoever. I think it's not particularly well documented for this item. And for your convenience, those are the ticket numbers on the various cases. Order matters. When you're submitting a list of values with Zabbix sender, the first value that arrives is the one that will be processed first. And if you're having no data triggers and you had a time where you didn't send any data, even if the data arrives, it might go to a problem state, which is not what you expected. LLD items, or particularly the rule items, are difficult as well, because JSON accepts only UTF-8 and no trailing commas, and you have to get the structure right. Some people think it's freeform, which is wrong for obvious reasons. And you have to get the macros right and the characters you can use in macros for LLD. This is one of the two basic examples I wanted to show you. We've got the tools. We know what is going on in the agent, basically. And how will we target a specific problem now? I call this approach the bottom-up approach. It's common sense actually, but I think it's good pointing it out anyway. This is a flowchart I created once when I got sick of answering the same kind of problem again and again, going through 20 questions each time. It's not important to actually read it. You can find it on Zabbix.org. But it has the approach of, I'm trying to query an item. Is the agent running? Yes. Is the listener present? Yes. Can the server contact the listener? Basically, yes. And so forth and so forth. Those flowcharts are a good idea if you have a number of administrators that are not that familiar with Zabbix and you want them to be able to solve simple problems. But you have to have some domain-specific knowledge to create such a graph, actually. And in cases where you know very little of what is going on, or no such flowchart worked for you, it is probably easier to just poke right into the middle of the problem, or at one end, to bisect the problem, to cut it down as easy as you possibly can. The example here is an agent is responding with a value which we hadn't expected. And those are two approaches to the very same problem. The first being running Zabbix get locally, finding out that the value is actually okay, then running Zabbix server, running Zabbix get from the server, and finding out that the value is okay still, but in the front end it's the wrong reading. What might be going on, that might actually be a name resolution problem. Somebody might have changed the configuration and the records from the name server they query is obsolete, and that would require a server restart, for instance. Same problem, different approach. Set the log level to 4 on the agent, or tcpdump on the agent host, and take a look if anything is coming in at all. And in this example, I was assuming there was nothing coming in, but there is general connectivity between the server and the agent, and it's apparent that the requests obviously are not going out at all, or are going to a different host, and that just cut down the problem area vastly. This concludes my presentation. If you want to approach me on this presentation or any other work I did before, feel free to just talk to me or write me an email or visit IRC. We've got a very active channel, very supportive channel, and here's a list of 4 extra readings you may enjoy. That's a blog article that actually got me started on this topic for the conference. The troubleshooting page on the Zabbix.org wiki has the flowchart, and another one I was showing you before. The protocols are well documented thanks to the courtesy of Rehartz and Demir. And if you're interested in TCP/IP, this is a book I can very recommend to you very much. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm open to questions, of course.
Will you please make the slides available?
They will. They certainly will be available, just like all the other slides. But you can actually download it right now. I've got them on my website. I will tell you the URL.